Coming to you direct from the nerve center of the galaxy's greatest comic. This is the 2000 AD Thrillcast.
Borag Thung Earthlets, and welcome to the latest episode of the 2000 AD Thrillcast. And on this episode, it's the master, Brian Bolland. Now, when you're talking about the artists on Judge Dredd, obviously there's the co-creator Ezquerra, there's Mick McMahon, and then there's Bolland. So many people's perceptions of Judge Dredd as a character have been shaped by Bolland's artwork. Thanks in part to the amazing covers he did for the Eagle reprints in the 1980s. Co-creator of Judge Death, Judge Anderson, Judge Hershey. For an artist who had a relatively small body of work, particularly in comparison to others on the series, he's had such a huge influence on the way that people view Judge Dredd. So it was an absolute pleasure and a privilege to be able to chat away to him for so long, 2 hours. So make sure you're sitting down comfortably for this one, Earthlets. Huge thanks to David Price, who runs the UK Comics Fanzine website archive, for some help with a bit of research for this, and also David Roach, who we spoke to a few episodes ago. Keep your eyes peeled for more stuff from the 2000 AD Thrillcast in relation to Mr. Bolland and Mr. Roach. We've hopefully got some nice stuff coming up in the future. So, yeah, not a huge intro from me on this one, because let's get to the nitty-gritty. Let's hear from Brian Bolland himself. Enjoy, Earthlets. I'll be honest with you, Brian. I've been meaning to interview you properly on this for ages, because we had you on to talk about Prog 2000 a few years ago.
Did you?
Yeah.
Was that the one that where I did the cover? Was that the cover with them doing the Iwo Jima flag thing? Was that?
No. Sequentials for Prog 2000.
Sorry?
You did sequentials for Prog 2000.
I did the first page, didn't I?
Yeah.
I've got it right there. I'll put it up to the camera if necessary. Yes, I'm sorry. I was thinking of another one where I did a cover to commemorate something that had all the 2000 AD characters planting the flag, like in the Iwo Jima, capturing a Japanese island in the Second World War, but they were sticking the pole into a whole heap of defunct British comics.
Yes, yeah.
Did you see that one?
Yes, that was. Oh God, was that the 25th anniversary? I think, or something.
Something like that. I think it was actually in the 90s. Now I've got this one. I mean, this makes fascinating. That's the one you're talking about, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, I did. I had the first page in there. Yes. Excellent. Good.
So I just kind of go into these things and just start chatting. Really, I mean, just a moment ago you said that you're not doing work at the moment, so you're using the opportunity to do stuff that you want to. What kind of things are you working on?
Actually, I have been working up to about a month ago for stuff that, like this Joker commemorative thing, and I did a Wonder Woman cover. I did 2 Metal Men covers for DC Comics, which was paid work, but nothing at the moment. So there's a couple of things I just felt like I did a cover. A close up of the Joker on it. Sorry, this one. There's going to be visuals. Yeah, that one. And that was commissioned. But so I've been quite busy working. But then I thought, I love the Penguin. I love drawing the Penguin probably more than the Joker, and so I thought I'd do an equivalent cover for that on spec. Now, of course, now that they're in lockdown or whatever, they've so far got no further use for it, so they're not going to pay me for it. But I'm doing things that I'm enjoying, like this thing I showed you with the big orange creature on it.
I suppose the best way to start talking, and that ties neatly into that, is that you have a huge love of I guess what we now call Silver Age comics, because that's when you started reading. You grew up in sort of rural Lincolnshire.
I grew up in a place called Butterwick. I shall adopt the accent. Butterwick, in Lincolnshire, and then just up the road from Boston, the original Boston, on the way to Skegness, yes, in 1951.
And I suppose what I kind of want to form really is an idea of your childhood and the influence that comics had, because from the interviews that I've read previously, that they were a fairly constant presence in your childhood. I think your dad bought you Look and Learn when you were younger.
That's true. Yes, he thought that. I think Look and Learn must have. Oh, slightly. Look and Learn, I think, was sold as a kind of educational thing. It would be good for kids, because he was very keen to get me educated somehow, and I think he thought Look and Learn would be useful in that respect. But of course, I just read the comics. That would have been. Was Don Lawrence in that? Yes. So I was given Look and Learn, and I think I've still got a few of those. But it was when I first got American comics. There was a stall in the market twice a week, and they sold these American comics, DC Comics and Dell. And the first one I bought, which I could hold up to the screen right now if you want, was called Dinosaurus in 1960 or 61. I'll take it out of its bag, because I'm not all that precious about it. It'll always go back in again.
Wow, amazing.
You see that?
Yeah.
Very similar to the thing I'm drawing at this moment, actually. I don't know who the original cover artist was, but the inside was by a fellow called Jesse Marsh. Not a great fan favourite, but I loved it. So that started me off with American comics. Yes. I shall keep my answers briefer from now on.
Oh, no. I like rambly answers by all means. It's
Okay.
it's great stuff. What was it about these comics that grabbed you as a kid? Because I mean, I guess growing up in a village, not many opportunities for entertainment, I guess.
No, I mean in Boston there were two cinemas, so I was able to see the occasional film. I wasn't really into films that early, but there isn't an awful lot to do. I mean, my father was a farmer, so I was occasionally out picking potatoes. And there wasn't really. I mean, of course, in the early '60s, television was really black and white. Television was just starting out, so I was really keen on the Avengers. With Patrick McNee, John Steed. As we speak, Honor Blackman died only about 3 days ago, and she was the original companion to John Steed in the Avengers in 1963. So there was stuff like that on the go. And then my favourite TV show was The Outer Limits. Have you ever heard of that?
Yeah, not only have I heard of it, I watched reruns when I was younger.
Really?
Yeah.
That was fantastic stuff. So it was just a bit of television, and the comics, which was in black and white, and of course the comics were a very exciting thing.
I read an interview with you where you described the comics that you bought through the market stall as treasure. That these were kind of a glimpse into another world. Was this something that sparked your imagination?
Yeah, obviously, yeah. I mean, there was very little other visual stimulus, black and white television, a little bit of science fiction through Outer Limits. But I think I have said in the past, and I think it's true, that I've very little regard for the stories. I think I respond very much to the visual stimulus. So I was into giant monsters, I loved, as a kid, I was one of those kids, a lot of kids go through a dinosaur phase. I love at that sort of age, giant monsters. And I still respond very nostalgically to seeing these images that must have just gone, burned into my eyes, I suppose, but have very little memory of the stories. There'd be a monster and then there wouldn't be a monster. So I'm very ignorant of people who write these stories. A lot of them. A lot of people, when they talk about comics they loved as kids, they go back and reread them. I've got no interest in rereading them. In fact, I don't even open them because they were just things that were treasures at the time, and they still are. Although, of course, I've sold my collection now; it's all gone. Apart from that one thing.
So there were a lot of, like you said, we talked about Look and Learn. There were things like the Eagle, which had launched.
That was before my time. You know,
Yeah.
I've got some Eagles, but I bought them from you know, as a collector because of the Frank Hampson artwork.
I'm interested in the way that you responded to British comics and American comics, because you know the British industry was very in very good health at the time, but you're getting these DC comics coming over. Probably in the ballast of ships, or you know.
So the story goes. Yes, they just filled up ships so they sat properly on the Plimsoll line, I think. So they filled them up full of bales of comics. So the story goes. At the same time as getting into a pile of comics that was growing, that was before Marvel. So my early collection was mostly DC, with a few Gold Key and Dell comics. But I was also keen on, I got the Valiant, which was Fleetway, wasn't it?
Yeah.
That was a wonderful weekly treat. You know, Mytek the Mighty, Eric Bradbury's Mytek the Mighty, Jesus Blasco's Steel Claw were weekly treats in the British comics. And also a couple of newspaper strips that I loved. Not Jane, I've just been reading about Jane in David's book, Carol Day, written and drawn by David Wright, whose work I still love, and also Sid Jordan's Jeff Hawke, which I loved. I just clip that out every day. So, you know, it was a mixture for me of collecting DC comics and also collecting these clippings from newspapers. And incidentally, I don't know whether you're familiar with Jeff Hawke, but only a few days ago I spoke to Sid Jordan on the phone. Because there's a fellow making 3D printed models of Sid Jordan's Jeff Hawke characters, about that sort of big, you know, for 10 quid each. And I'm going to get myself some because I love those characters. And Sid Jordan's now 91 and in good health as far as I know. And you ought to interview her.
Well, you mentioned a few artists there. I'm particularly interested in the kind of Jesus Blasco influence, because looking at work like that, for me, it's very easy to see that as a clearly formative experience for you, a formative style. You know, it's that beautiful line work that you were being exposed to when you were younger.
Well, I mean, the thing is, I always thought of American comics as like the stained glass window technique. You know, basically, American artists draw an outline, and you know, there's the penciler, the inker, the colorist, the letterer. It's all compartmentalized, and the artist was just someone who drew the outline, and then somebody would come along and paint Superman blue and red, Batman blue and grey. But our comics were in black and white, and we had to understand, like a lot of the great American, you know, Milt Caniff and people, all those people who understood light and shade. Chiaroscuro is the term, I think. We had to learn that by looking at people like Jesus Blasco, not Jesus. I tend to call him Jesus because I think that's kind of fun. And Eric Bradbury and some of the others. We had to learn how to convey this stuff without the luxury of colour, with the use of, you know, black and white and tones. And God, Blasco was so good at it. I think I learned how to draw foliage from him. He was very good at leaves.
The Steel Claw is one of those strips that's now part of the Rebellion archive since we bought IPCs.
Is it?
Yeah. So hopefully, we've got Charlie Adlard and Charlie Higson, the comedian and writer, to do a story with him in the Smash special, which is coming out next month.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Excellent. It's a special of the Steel Claw.
Well, it's a Smash special, so it's an anthology. But yeah, one of the stories will be Steel Claw, which is.
See, again, I've got vivid impressions of the artwork, but I don't really recall. I remember one story which was about the brain, the craniums, I think. Do you know what I'm talking about?
No.
It was a rural English village. This was in Valiant every week. And it was a rural English village And he was very good at, if he was drawing a rural English village, people in the pub would look like rural English people. And if he was drawing a scene in New York, they would look like New Yorkers sitting or standing in a bar. But anyway, these rural Brits on their bicycle were confronted by this alien invasion of sort of eyeballs on legs, on tentacle legs. And I'm sure it was a good story, but I don't remember how it went. But the artwork was fantastic. They came and then were defeated somehow, and then they left.
There was a fascinating interview that you did. I mean, we're talking 30 years ago in a fanzine, where drawing in black and white is a far more fundamental discipline than color. And I just wondered what you thought about that now.
Well, I agree. I mean, I think the artists I like best, their work is perfectly good to look at without the color added. In fact, often, because nowadays when I send in a cover, I tend to also send in the black and white line work on its own, because it often looks good. And of course, one of my favorite artists, Alex Toth, was also a great expert at the black and white, but even when his work was printed color, it still worked well. But it worked also very well without the color. His Zorro work, for instance, and Bravo for Adventure, they all work well in black and white. Does that relate to your question? I can't remember what your question was. I'm just rambling.
No, like I said, rambling is good. Rambling is good.
Okay.
But it's more because I always try and trace lines back to formative experiences, and you're known for your line work, and it like I said, it seems clear to me looking at your influences just how influential those have been on how you think about comics and the way that you draw as well. And I wondered if you saw those links as well, or it was an innate thing that just kind of grew up over time.
Yeah, I mean, there are obviously links. I mean, I could list all the people who influenced me. I remember David Roach being asked, "Why do you draw in the style you draw in?" And he said, "Well, nobody draws in a style. We just draw the way we can." And in my case, I went through a phase of trying to be Neil Adams very early on when I was doing DC work, and it looked a little bit Adamsy. But I can sort of trace certain things I do back to people like Blasco and Gil Kane, who was one of my heroes when I was in my early teens. Yeah, I can see little traces of all of those people in there. Yeah.
You mentioned Neil Adams. Now, he is a big influence on you, isn't he? Because I think you did your thesis at college.
I did, yes. In complete ignorance, just based on my own observations of what I was looking at on the page. I didn't know anything about the man. Yeah.
It's something that I bought it when I chatted to Ian Kennedy the other day, because he went to art college. Mike Dory went to art college. Lots and lots of people have been to art college. With people who've gone on to work in comics, there seems to be this thread of people either leaving art college early or not getting on with their lectures because they are interested in college. And then you're delivering a thesis on Neil Adams. I mean, did your teachers even know who Neil Adams was?
No, they didn't. No. Well, I mean, I was asked this question recently, actually. I was at college from 1969 to 1974, and up till the very end of that period, comics was certainly not considered anything worth looking at either in the field of art or design or any of the fields I was supposed to be studying. And the tutors saw that I was doing some of this stuff. I mean, I was also doing the kind of thing they liked, some graphic design and some typography. And it wasn't even an illustration course that I was on, it was a graphic design course. And the final thesis, I decided I was going to do it on comics, which was this completely alien field to these people. They didn't know anything about it and didn't really care anything about it. And then when I turned the thesis in, I decided that there was so much to say about Neil Adams alone that I made it exclusively about him. And when I turned it in, they'd never heard of him. And since it wasn't the subject that I'd announced it was going to be about at the beginning, they thought maybe it was a big hoax, because the final picture of Neil was a rather funny picture of him with a bit of a smirk, a bit of a grin, not a smirk, a kind of cheeky grin. And I think they thought, is this guy for real, or have I made him up? But I convinced them that he was actually a real person, but they'd never heard of him.
What was it about Neil's work that so attracted you to it?
I mean, the first work I saw of him was in 1967. I mean, you might be able to do the research and tell me when, because I was a DC collector. I remember him doing an elongated man story in the back of the Flash, possibly. And then he was doing stuff for Creepy and Eerie for Warren. And then later, of course, he was doing Green Lantern and Green Arrow, memorably. But I think lots of people fell in love with his work. It was just, I think a lot of the art at that period, 67 to 70, was getting very stale. And there were one or two standout people, probably all of Marvel by now. But he just came along with a realistic style that was also incredibly dynamic, kinetic almost, more so nowadays, and also sort of tore apart the whole structure of the page layout. Dead Man, for instance, he did a whole page where there are something like 6 panels where the action was carrying on. And if you looked at the whole page, that all those 6 panels of different bits of action made up one giant head of the lead character, Dead Man. Stuff like that he was doing, which was just way ahead of what anyone else was doing. And I think a lot of artists came along and became Neil Adams clones. I think Bill Sienkiewicz started off as a Neil Adams lookalike, and quite a lot of others as well. Mike Netzer, people like that.
At this time, were you thinking that you could be a comic book artist?
Well, I knew that people did it, obviously, because it was there on paper, the proof was there. And I mean, I started out in comics fandom, in the 60s, age 16 or 17. And we got to know gradually other comic fans like Dave Gibbons, Paul Neary, Barry Smith, actually, Windsor Smith, I beg his pardon. And then gradually we saw that Barry was drawing Conan, and oh yes, and of course I finished the art school thing, and I was good mates with Dave Gibbons by then, and he recommended Barden Press Features with Barry Coker in Farringdon Street in London, because by then I think he must have been getting regular work in various British comics, and you'll have to do the research on that. David would know. Yes, it was clear that it was a paid profession. Whether I could get into it was to some extent, you're always fairly arrogant about what you do. You think you're good. Everybody thinks they're good, don't they? So I obviously thought I was good enough to show people what I was doing some pretty rude stuff at the time, because I started off drawing for Oz and International Times and some fanzines where I drew Little Nympho in Slumberland. And I did a thing in my final college year with bondage, people in bondage. And so when I showed these samples to the people at Barden Press Features, there was a fellow called Keith, and there was Barry Coker. And Keith, I think, was a bit more old school, and I had long hair. And I think he took one look at me and what I was doing, and I thought, no. But I must have had some confidence in my technique, regardless of subject matter. I obviously thought, I'm not bad. But fortunately, they saw enough in me to give me work. But I mean, for a long time, there was no work going. So I went through a very bleak period when there was no stuff out. There was Napoleonic War comics. There was some war. I did some war comics for DC Thompson, I think, just a few 2 pages, and a bit of Gothic stuff. But I was really struggling and quite low until more regular work came.
Because as you came out of art college, I think there was was it the 1972 convention that you attended and met people like?
You're very well researched, aren't you? You know this. Go on. What was the question? Form your question.
Well, it was the 1972 convention where you met people like Dave Gibbons and guys like that.
Yeah.
And
I think Terry Gilliam was there too.
I believe he was as well.
Bob Monkhouse was there, who was a comedian from the television, who was also a great collector of comics, and apparently was an artist too. Yeah, loads of people were there. So it was Dave Gibbons. Oh God, I couldn't even remember all the people that were there. I think Frank Bellamy was there, and lots of people like Nick Landor, Mike Lake, people who had earned their skin. All the people who either went on to become artists, or editors, or publishers, or distributors like Nick and what were they called to begin with? Was it Titan Distribution? Titan Distributors. And then they opened for business. So all the people who were just fans who were at the 1972 convention all became this kind of in crowd of nepotists, really, who were able to give each other leg ups into the field, really. Yeah, it was a good time. And of course, it was over the weekend, so we always had to sleep under a table somewhere on the Saturday night.
I've done the same at conventions myself, to be honest with you.
And a lot of drink was consumed, I think, on those occasions and later.
So at this point, you're going to things like the 1972 convention. You're drawing for underground comic books like ours. But that change to working for Barden Press, that was still quite a key moment, really, wasn't it? Even though the industry was still quite traditional, your Napoleonic War stuff, the kind of romance stuff, I believe that you were kind of being pushed towards as well.
I did even have a crack at that, because I liked Carol Day by David Wright, so I had a crack at doing sort of romance comics. Where those bits of artwork have gone, I have no idea. But yeah, I had a crack at those. Yeah, go on, sorry.
But you said that you were struggling. Was this in terms of your mood at the time? Were you thinking, do I really want to do this? Is this kind of the future for me?
Well, I didn't know what tool to use. I think as a fan artist, I started off with biros, ballpoint pens and crayons and things. And then I discovered the repeatograph. Me and a young friend, Dave Harwood, who was from the same part of the world as me, we did that sort of thing together. And there's a whole list of things we did during that decade. But why was I low? I was living in Tottenham, and I was producing some samples. I've got them in a drawer here. I couldn't find them too quickly there. And I wasn't liking the subject matter very much, or I didn't know enough about people wearing, with bayonets and that sort of thing. I don't know why I was so low. I remember ringing up my dad, and I was really very low. And then I've moved a couple of times. But yes, I was low because I just didn't see any particular future in it, or, I didn't know how to support myself at the time. And you get low in those circumstances, don't you?
You mentioned Dave Harwood there. Now, this is going back to before this point, but you produced comic books of your own when you were younger, I believe, with Dave.
Yes,
yeah,
with Dave Harwood, yes.
What was this riffing off the DC comics you were reading at the time, or was it your own creations?
We had our own characters. We did a thing called Epic, and it had one of my characters, one of Dave's characters, and two. Who were the others? There was a DC, and it was one of those dream ideas where our two characters and a couple of established characters from comics would have an adventure together. And I did some characters right at the very beginning when I was 11 called the Insect League. And I've got, well, I say hundreds of pages. I probably haven't got hundreds, but they're all down there in a suitcase. And that was, if you can imagine superheroes drawn by an 11-year-old, that's what they look like. But they got better. I mean, I've got, over the next 4 years, I did a sort of Quatermass style story where a guy goes off in a spaceship and comes back and his hand turns into a giant cactus, just like in one of those Quatermass stories. So I was doing that sort of thing with Dave Hull, just one-offs that were never, because in those days you didn't really get anything published. Only, this Zoom, we've just started the Zoom thing. Only a few days ago, I had a Zoom conversation with a guy who published my very first, well, he was the second guy actually, to publish my very early work. I was 16 and he was 14. And he did a fanzine where Dave and my work, he published it. So in America, he was an American guy. So the big treat was not only to draw these things for each other, to show each other, but to actually see them in print. And I still, for me, the kick I get is not looking at artwork, but it's looking at the thing you've done in the finished printed form. So it was a treat.
Because it's so very different now. You get yourself a website, you get yourself social media, you can put your drawings up online dead easy. But I guess at that time, because there were so few routes through to professional publishing,
that's right.
Fanzines were how you did it when you were a kid.
And I think we used what photocopying machines, or what were they called? Those machines, and you wouldn't know, you're too young, but those sort of machines we used to reproduce and they're terrible. The reproductions were pretty terrible. I thought I had some on hand, but there aren't any. I think I put them away.
And how important was it to have a friend that you could bounce off with these things?
Oh, it was great. I mean, I was at school with a guy called Jeff Harwood, and I just happened to drop that I had these American comics that I was collecting, and he said, "Oh, my brother does that, my brother Dave." And so I went off to see this lad who was 2 years older than me, and he had this collection of comics. And also, gradually, as I knew him over the years, gradually we were collecting records together, because we've both got into people like Frank Zappa and Captain Beefheart and all sorts of people from that sort of late 60s era, which I still love. So we had this, oh, look what I've just bought, or look what I've just drawn. So I'd get on my bike, and I'd bike over to his house in the next village. And so he showed me what he'd just done and vice versa. And it is a good thing. I don't know whether most young artists have somebody that they can bounce. There's no point being an artist unless you could show your work to somebody. And in those days, it would have been a real person, a few doors away or something. But it was very important. Yeah.
Because it's one of those things that I guess you need somebody not just to bounce your work off, but just to sustain your interest, because you're batting back ideas back and forth.
Well, it's a bit like today, how people are all addicted to having like at the bottom of our picture in Facebook. How many likes has it got? Oh, 6. Oh, 7. I guess it's the same sort of impulse, isn't it? If you do something, there's no point you don't really want to do it in complete isolation. You want it to be seen and hopefully liked by others. There's always that impulse, isn't there?
We'll move on to what happened once you joined Barden Press, because again, this is something that comes up an awful lot when talking to artists and who started in the 60s and 70s. You got an agent. You were part of an agency, and they got you work and they took a cut. And it's so different now.
Is it?
Very few people have agents. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, I thought so. Yes. Yeah.
They'll have an agent for film and TV stuff.
Oh, do they? By which you mean storyboards and is that what you mean?
No, more what do you call it? By getting the rights to TV and film, so exploitation rights. They'll have an agent.
I see. So in other words, somebody like Mark Miller, who with his Kingsman or something,
yeah,
you would need an agent to interact with the film and TV company.
Yeah, that seems to be the main way.
I think Dave McKean has always had an agent, hasn't
he? Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, can't remember the chap's name, but I think he always has.
But through Barden, I think you got your first Time Out cover, didn't you?
Was that through Barden?
Possibly. I don't know. That's kind of what I'm asking as well.
Well, I've got to backtrack actually, because while still at college, my very first piece of paid work was a little illustration in a Time Out, and in those days, Time Out was about that big. It was half the scale. It was a very rinky-dinky little sort of fanzine-like sort of underground thing. But I got a little watercolor of a jazz bassist called Barry Guy, I think his name is, and in an early 2000 AD in 1972, for which they paid me a £5, and that was my very first paid work. But I mean, by the time I was a regular at 2000 AD drawing Judge Dredd. Judge Dredd became suddenly rather, popular, and somebody was doing a feature on this new, not renaissance, but surge in British comics, and with Judge Dredd in particular, and I got to do the cover. But would that have been commissioned? Would that have been through Barry Coker?
I mean, that's a good question. My notes can't.
I mean, I did 4 or 5 later Time Out covers for various. One of them was on the wall just up there, and I think I must have known somebody at Time Out at the time. I don't think they would have gone through Barden. Possibly the first one though.
One thing that I think you did get through Barden was working on Powerman.
Yeah, well, that was after this period of slump that I talked about, suddenly this 2-year or more gig of how many pages was Powerman? It was supposed to be bi-monthly. I think it was an issue every 2 weeks, and Dave Gibbons and I alternated. And it was we went and got interviewed by the people behind the project. It was a couple from Suffolk called Pickin Publications, and suddenly we were required to draw all these pages at a very rapid rate. And I've forgotten what your question was. Yes, Powerman. That was my first proper long-term gig, and £17 a page. Pretty good, eh?
Blimey, yeah, not too bad. Not too bad at all.
That's why I'm so affluent, you see.
Well, because this is a kind of it crops up. I've interviewed Dave Gibbons in the past, and it's kind of cropped up that this is one of his first kind of major gigs. But I mean, this was for Nigeria. This was for a Nigerian audience, and he was a black superhero.
Yes.
And did Kevin O'Neill work on it as well?
I was always very slow, and I had a couple of occasions when I was in crisis. There was one occasion in 1975 when, the same year that I started actually, when my father died, and I was behind already. And but you have to go and deal with things when something like that happens. And Dave Gibbons came and sat in my flat and helped me finish some pages, and Kevin finished some pages for me. I also had a friend, Hill Bevan, she prefers now, who was from my art school in Norwich, who came and did help me with it as well. But yeah, they helped me with a few emergency deadlines I struggled with. Yeah, but I don't think Kevin actually had a gig on Powerman. I think he helped me one or more.
Okay, because
Carlos was in there. Carlos Ezquerra was a backup thing in there, as I think was Ron Smith too.
I mean, that just makes it even more of a kind of forgotten link for me. You get all these artists working on this, let's face it, obscure character. Maybe not if you live in Nigeria, but this one project, and then so many of them go on to work at 2000 AD. I mean, was there? Did you have a sense at the time that everyone in your friendship circle was working towards the same thing? Were you all hanging out together?
No, I didn't. Well, all through that period, we were going to various London conventions because I lived in London at the time, and I knew Eddie Campbell and Dave and all the, because I'm trying to remember back. This is before 2000 AD. We knew each other from conventions. I didn't know Carlos. I didn't know Mick McMahon, who, was pretty much at the beginning of Judge Dredd, wasn't he? I think it was probably after I'd done a couple of years on Powerman that gradually we'd be all in at conventions and we all knew each other. Yeah, and I've forgotten your question again, but that's all I remember of that particular fact. Short-term memory, it happens to you when you get to this sort of...
No, I can barely remember 2 weeks ago. So
I can barely remember how I started this sentence.
I mean, with something like Powerman, you're being plunged into comics now. It's not just spot illustrations. It's not just doing your own thing. This is actual kind of the grind. And you said,
I mean, the terrible learning curve for me was that. Dave, I think, could draw a page a day. Back in my student days, I would be drawing a page a week. But now I had to really step up, and you couldn't go off and muck about for a bit and then come back to it when you felt like it. It had, towards the end of a month's work, I didn't sleep. The last 5 pages had to be drawn, so I just had to sit there that day and then carry on all through the night, and then the next day hopefully it would be finished. So it was quite a shock to the system. And I think I remember how I said this, that I once, when Dave came to help me finish that page, I remember watching his hand move across the page, and it was moving at 2 or 3 times the speed that mine does. I'm left-handed, actually. Funnily enough, this image in the corner here of me is a mirror image, isn't it? It's very disconcerting, that. Your sound has gone.
Sorry, I need to remember to press the space bar when I talk.
Have you ever seen Toast of London with Matt Berry?
Seen bits and bobs of it, yeah.
Oh, there's a wonderful character called Clem Fandango, and he speaks from a little box, and he keeps forgetting to put his finger on the button when he tells him the crucial. Anyway.
That's my podcasting icon there, I think.
Yes.
Yeah. The fact that it was such a shock to the system, did you think, maybe comics aren't my thing?
Oh, no. I didn't know. There was nothing. I love comics. I didn't really have any other skill at all. I didn't think for a moment that I would turn my back on it and go and be a refuse collector or something. I don't know, or a farmer. I don't think for a moment.
It's 3 o'clock.
Oh, that's my computer telling me it's 3 o'clock. No, I just had to bite the bullet and know that this is the way it was going to have to be, really. Yeah.
And tell me about how that experience on Powerman then translated into working for 2000 AD.
1977 came along. As far as I know, Fleetway hadn't really had any science fiction. Well, I suppose you'd call Valiant science fiction. I suppose Steel Claw was sci-fi in a way, wasn't it? And Mytek the Mighty had a giant robot ape. But it was only when Star Wars came along that I think Fleetway thought, well, maybe we should try the kind of Eagle formula again and have some sci-fi. And so I was invited to Barry Coker's office and had to have a meeting with Dave Gibbons and Carlos. And they showed me the mock-up of the first issue of 2000 AD and said, do you want to be part of this? I said, yeah. And anyway, the first story in the issue was drawn by Jesus Blasco, who's my hero. he did something called Invasion, did he?
Yeah.
So I thought, oh yeah, but Dave and Carlos were going to join in straight away, but they wanted me to carry on for a few months with Powerman. So it then went to a monthly schedule, and I just drew Powerman, one a month for a few more months. So I didn't get into 2000 AD until, issue 11 when I did a cover. So I had a little bit of Powerman to finish off, and I sort of filtered my way slowly into 2000 AD with covers, mainly for a while. Ron Tyler took over from me on Powerman.
I've got a note down here.
I beg his pardon, Tyner, Ron Tyner.
Ron Tyner, okay.
I apologise, Ron.
I've got a note down here without any notes around it, so I don't understand why I've written it down. It says, what, Walter Stripe? Oh, no, Walter Stripe. Ignore me. I'm going to come on to that later. I wanted to talk about the Walter the Wobot.
You don't know anything about this stuff, do you? You're just reading it all from notes. Press that button. Don't forget to press
my notes. Sorry.
Yeah, Walter. But I mean, the thing is, I'd started off drawing Judge Dredd. Well, also, I think I did what was that little thing that wasn't Judge Dredd? It was a short 2-page it wasn't Time Twisters. It was a little kind of one-off sort of shock ending.
The Future Shocks.
Future Shock. I did 1 or 2 of those, or maybe just 1. I'd done a few regular Judge Dredd episodes by now, thanks to being invited by Nick Landor. How I got to do Walter, I don't know. I mean, there's always a wonderful mixture of kind of hard sci-fi and you wouldn't call it horror, but also comedy in Judge Dredd, which is something that was really lacking from American comics. They were never able really to meld satirical comedy into hard adventure stories, were they? I don't think. Maybe that's unfair. Maybe they can now. I don't know. But I was asked to do just some Walters. I've got them here in this drawer, and I was able to do one of those a day.
Let's just pick up on that, because I do want to come back and talk more about getting into 2000 AD and Dredd and everything. But you mentioned that a page a day, so clearly your time on Powerman had changed you a bit as an artist. You were able to do it quicker.
It was a terrific exercise to do. I mean, I did about 280 pages, I think, of Powerman, and it was a terrific exercise to just turn out pages. You just had to get them turned out. That's the thing about a comic artist. They're not people who are always. People are not always going to see them as terrific draftsperson, but they are people who can get Dave Gibbons is the consummate comic book artist. He can do terrific work, and he can do it quickly to deadline. I'm not. Pretty soon it became evident that I needed more time. But, at least I'd had the 2 years or so of the experience at Powerman. It was a terrific experience that nobody could actually see it unless you happen to live in Nigeria. And I didn't know anybody in Nigeria at the time. I still don't, actually. Although I once at a convention, this very, very elegant young lady came, a youngish lady came along and said that she was from Nigeria and loved Powerman, which is a real treat. But anyway, it was a good exercise.
I mean, that's something that we talk about when we talk about people trying to break into the industry today, is that there are fewer opportunities now for people to get experience in print. You can publish your own stuff, but that's not necessarily going through the same structure. Really? But I guess that was worth its weight in gold for you.
Oh, terrific. Yes, it was. I mean, I feel up to now, I've had a very fortunate hand dealt to me. I've had 2 years at Powerman where I learned the trade. I got straight into drawing a character that turned out to be one of Britain's most iconic comic book characters. Through him, I was able to be noticed by the Americans. And yes, it was, and again, I've forgotten what you asked me. I mean, a world of my own. I'm in my own reverie here.
It's all good. It's all good. Well, let's talk about Dredd, because you came to Dredd at a time when there were quite a few artists who had drawn him, who were drawing him. You look at the longer stories like the Cursed Earth, where because of the pace of the comic, different episodes.
There were loads of this.
Yeah. What did you think about Dredd at the beginning? When you first saw the character, what did you think about him?
Well, it was right at the beginning. It wasn't evident. I don't think it was even evident at 2000 AD that Judge Dredd was the character that was the poster boy for the comic. He wasn't always. He was very rarely on the cover. And the first cover I drew of him was the one with the Jolly Green Giant, who we should not discuss because it was under copyright restrictions for a long time. But now I think it's okay. You see that Carlos created him. Carlos and John and Pat Mills was part of that, I think. Was he or not?
Yeah, it seems to have been a kind of milieu of different perspectives.
Yes. On that. But for some reason, right from the beginning, Carlos then didn't actually do the one that was first in print. That was actually McMahon. I didn't know Mick. Mick was not one of the people part of the little fan group from the conventions. I didn't know him at all. And so he came along as a sort of Carlos impersonator, I believe.
That was one of the reasons why he was hired. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think Mick's experience was the War Picture Libraries. He knew all about the Spanish artists and the Italian artists. I think that's the stuff he grew up on. He never grew up with any fondness for the American stuff the way Dave Gibbons and I did. But his style developed so meteorically that, whenever I would go into 2000 AD in Kingsreach Tower, if there was some pages of Mick there, that's the stuff we were all cooing over. I loved his work, and I still believe that it was the phase where he dominated the art of Judge Dredd, where he created the Judge Dredd that we see today. I think gradually the shape of the helmet changed, the little eye slits changed, the huge feet, the lip. So I, with my rather more conventional superhero style, was trying to do with that style my version of what Mick was doing. It had to be comedic and sort of rude at times, sort of, because there are all sorts of moral, ethical, there's greyness in I was always trying to draw Judge Dredd in such a way that he wasn't likable. He's not a nice guy, really, is he? And I think all of that sort of stuff. And those wonderful stories, and the way Mick was drawing him, so not like a superhero, really influenced me hugely. And again, I've forgotten what your initial question was.
No, that was perfect. It's on the day the law died, the Judge Cal storyline where I think the two of you were swapping back and forth on a few episodes. How because obviously you're having to work on this stuff quite quickly and get it in time for deadline. How aware were you? And it sounds like you were very aware of what the others were doing, and was there a kind of constant shift in what you were doing to go, oh well, I really like what they've done, so I'll match the tone, I'll see if I can.
Well, I suppose there must have been. The lovely thing about 2000 AD is that they do allow artists to draw in different styles. If you look all through the years, you'll see one style of drawing completely different from, and even the people drawing Judge Dredd were working in different styles. I don't think Ron Smith's work was very similar to Mick's, for instance, or Carlos. But I think the characters were so distinctly, when I say drawn, I mean sort of created in the minds of everybody, that it did. I think every one of us got the idea that there's a comedic element to this, a satirical. The League of Fatties, I mean, when Judge Cal promoted his fish, there's a sort of humour in there that we all could see, and I think we all did it reasonably well. I don't think, looking at the artists who drew Judge Dredd, I don't think any of them you could say, I don't think they got it really.
What did you feel about the costume? Because one of the things that has always fascinated me about Dredd, and it's something that some American critics touch on, is he shouldn't work as a character. That costume is ridiculous. I mean, John Wagner's reaction to it at the time was he looks like a fucking Spanish pirate. I've
never heard that. Yeah. Well, I mean, you wouldn't be able to move very well in all that gear, would you? You couldn't really have your gun strapped to your foot, and you wouldn't be able to see out of that thing very well. But anyway, go on, carry on.
As someone who'd been doing superheroes, like Powerman is a pretty straightforward superhero in the tradition of Superman. How did you adapt to suddenly all of this detail that you had to insert into panels?
Well, I think in my case, as an art student, I had gone through years of looking at all kinds of stuff. I'd drawn underground stuff for Oz and underground magazines and that sort of thing. So I was never really committed to the kind of big-chested, barrel-chested superhero. There was always kind of a cynicism and a satire in the stuff I liked and preferred to do. And again, I can't remember who you asked me. Ask me again.
Right. So, what was your reaction to having to draw this more complex character with all these symbols all over?
Well, I think I was glad of it because I love looking at Mick's work, and the thing I noticed about Mick's figure of Judge Dredd was he was not barrel-chested. He was not a heroic type. He had a slouch. I love Robert Crumb's work. Now, there are characters in Robert Crumb, like in Keep on Trucking, where they're sort of got huge feet and they stick their feet right out and they're kind of concave in shape. And looking at Mick's work, I could see there was no trace of the sort of superhero stuff in there. And I was perfectly happy to draw this kind of not a very fit-looking character. No, I was perfectly happy to do that. It came quite naturally to me.
How do you feel your style evolved over the time drawing Judge Dredd? Because you go from the Day the Law Died all the way through the Cursed Earth. All the way through to Blockmania. You've got things like Punks Rule OK.
Well, I think by Blockmania, I think I'd finished. Oh no, I think the last one I did was it called Orlok? Where they're having a punch up in the rain.
Yeah, that was the tail end of Blockmania, just before the Apocalypse War. Yeah.
Yes. What did you want to know again?
Well, it's how you felt your style evolved over that time, and what you were trying to bring to it as things changed.
I don't think it really evolved. I mean, artists can be very boring. They spend most of their time talking about line width and sort of what consistency of ink they use and what kind of ink they use, whether they use a pen or a brush. And so people like me and Dave Gibbons can go. I'm sure we could talk boringly for ages about that sort of thing. And so I was actually, during the time I was drawing the Three Dark Judges, I think there was about 30 pages of that, I think. And I remember thinking, because I always drew with a brush and ink. And it was always a struggle, because if you bought a new brush, and I'm going to do that, because occasionally you get a brush and the end points wouldn't be the same length. So you'd be drawing on a piece of paper, and eventually the two brush, kind of rude, the two, the true brush points would separate. If the brush was too old, it would be so clogged up with ink that you couldn't use it. So you didn't need a new one or an old one. You just needed one that was sufficiently broken in. So a lot of the time, my style was really struggling with technical matters like that. What I was drawing was, and I think drawing the Three Dark Judges, I was delighted with just how smoothly it was all going. And I could still look at those lines and remember thinking, yeah, those lines got laid on that bit of paper really very nicely. And I was kind of, the drawing, sometimes the drawings come out of you without a lot of effort. Other times it's a struggle. But as for whether anything was changing, it was really to do with what sort of thing. I mean, when I was drawing Walter the Wobot, I threw in a character that was straight out, a straight swipe of Don Martin in Mad magazine. Just completely incongruously, a Don Martin character would be in with Walter. So you could say my style had changed in that regard. There were phases with Judge Dredd where I was using the Marx Brothers and Rondo Hatton, who was a black and white horror movie star. And I was using a more sort of stipple effect. But, you change your style and your technique to match whatever the material is. But by that time, everything else was remaining the same. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, absolutely. In terms of going from pencils to inks, how tight were your pencils? Was most of it in the inking?
Ooh, that's a good question. I mean, I could talk about my penciling because later on with my DC work, because in 1982, I then was doing a long series for DC called Camelot 3000, where it was all in pencil. And there was so much of it that I needed an inker. And because I was so precious, about my work, I didn't really want somebody else inking it. I pencil it to death. And we even considered shooting the artwork from the pencils. So in those days, when I knew I had an inker, my pencils were incredibly tight. I think I probably drew everything A4, and then I think I had an Artograph projector at the time where you do your first sketches, page sketches, and I've got loads so I could show you if I could find them. And then you blow them up in the projector, and yes, I mean, there's another story I could tell you about that whole process, but I think my pencils were, I mean, I can't see what they're like now because the ones I did all myself are all covered in ink now, so I can't actually see what the pencils look like because they've been rubbed out. But as far as I can remember, I always penciled pretty thoroughly.
I mean, by all means, tell us the story about projecting the stuff.
Okay. Well, when I was doing full color work for 2000 AD and DC and all sorts of people, it would start with an A4 drawing in pencil, which I really like, and I've still got a lot of them up there. You then put it in the projector and you blow it up onto the artwork, which it never projected it square. You always had to faff around with it so the heads didn't become too big in relation to the body. You then had to draw the whole thing again for the second time. And then you inked it. That's going over it for the third time. And if it was in colour, I then have to use the airbrush, use the sort of Frisk film to mask out the bits you're not going to spray paint on. And then, once you had all the colour on, some of the colours, especially the yellow, were so milky and chalky that they actually obscured the black line you started off with. So I then have to get my ink brushes again and go over the ink lines a second time, by which time I was so bored with drawing the bloody thing that I thought there's got to be a better way of doing this, which is part of the reason I switched to using a computer, because you don't have to actually worry about chalky coloured yellows.
We'll come on to talking about a switch to digital in a bit. I wanted to just move on to chatting about Anderson and Death, who debuted in the same story back in 1980.
Yeah.
Judge Death, and I'm sure you've been over this a million times before. Judge Death is such a unique character, such a unique portrayal. where did that come from? How much was in the script? How did you come up with the design of him?
Well, I sometimes think, gosh, because when, Anderson and Judge Dredd and all these characters, they seem to crop up a lot. I mean, early on, John Wagner was writing a story, a self-contained story each week, and those characters would never appear again. It was only a bit later that a more American approach where characters would recur and then stories would sort of progress, continuity, I think they call it, don't they? And I sort of think, well, gosh, they're so popular, these characters, and yet I co-created Anderson and Hershey even, and Judge Dredd and all the others. But what were my instructions when I was told there's going to be this creepy guy coming down the stairs? I really can't remember what John Wagner wrote in the script at all. I remember looking at Kevin O'Neill's Torquemada and Nemesis, and I rather liked all those kind of helmets they were all wearing. And I just took the easy road out and pinched one of those ideas, really, and had this kind of, well, where did the face come? I think, to be quite honest, I think I was kind of projecting into possibly drawing the Joker one day. I think there's a bit of similarity there. There's a kind of the rictus grin, because I really, yeah. But when the 4 Dark Judges came along, were there 4 of them?
Yeah, they were. Yeah.
I think John did actually have a say in what they should look like, and I remember doing some drawings of possible versions of those characters, which again I've got in this drawer here. I think he mentioned devilfish. One of the characters had a head like a devilfish. There's a fish that's got the teeth. So I have got a few alternate versions of those characters that we rejected. So there was a bit of discussion between us about what they should look like.
Well, at the time, you mentioned about the fact that most villains in Judge Dredd did not recur because he would shoot them or he would put them in the cubes. Yeah. When not only Death came back, but the other 3 Dark Judges came in. I mean, can you remember what your reaction to that was? Were you pleased that finally you had characters of your own, I guess?
Well, as a comic artist in those days, you had very little control over anything. You did your work, you got a script, you sent it in, there was no royalties, you got paid for it, there were no royalties, you never get to meet your bosses, and anything could happen beyond that point. So I never really, there was no such thing as thinking, oh, I co-created this stuff, I would get something out of this. So whenever a character like that would carry on drawn by somebody else, it's always a real treat to think, well, I was the first person to draw that character. So it's quite nice, really. I've got a model up there. I showed it to a guy on Zoom the other day. Somebody sent me a model of, I'm going to get it down actually. I've got one of these.
Oh yes, yeah, lovely.
Which is pretty good, isn't it?
Yeah.
Somebody told me they're 180 quid. These things.
They're not cheap.
It's quite big and quite heavy, and it comes with a lot of spare heads. And I was showing this to a guy on Zoom the other day, and the spare heads are all sitting loose at the bottom, and Judge Dredd's spare head fell off and broke. So I've recently broken this thing. Fortunately, the head he's got at the moment is intact, and as is that. But anyway, yeah, it's all, oh God, it's going to come loose. I think I need to get rid of that thing before I drop it into and shatter into a million pieces.
If it's any consolation, of the 3 that we have in the office, I think only 1 has escaped unscathed.
Oh really? You've got some of those?
Yeah.
I think its feet are about to come loose from his ground, actually. But Yeah.
When you've got a character like Judge Anderson, who has gone on to have such a huge effect on the world of Dredd, you know, she's been a constant presence. She's had her own adventures and everything.
Yeah. Right.
When you were creating her, what was your inspiration?
Debbie Harry.
Definitely Debbie Harry.
Well, I just needed a face, and I like that. I like comic artists have a requirement to be able to draw gorgeous women. It's a meme in, you know, there's always been that strand. I mean, Neil Adams could do it, and David Wright, Carol Day, they could do it, and there is a thing. Now, up till that point, British comics were either for boys or for girls, or for little children, I think. They were very compartmentalized, and the comics for boys appeared to be about boy stuff. They appeared to be about football, war. And I noticed right at the beginning of 2000 AD that there were no girls in 2000 AD to begin with. There were no female characters that I could think of. I don't actually remember a female appearing, apart from some incidental character in the background who had a belly wheel or something. So it seemed rather strange that in these comics that were written and drawn by boys for boys, we had a girl in there. So it was quite nice. I mean, boys like girls, you know. Some of them, not everyone. It was quite nice to have. Yes, and I needed to. I mean, I can draw people without having to look at real people. I think I did do an ad for Forbidden Planet. Forbidden Planet, the shop, their second shop was a shop selling film memorabilia, and I did an ad that had Debbie Harry and David Bowie and Mick Jagger and a few others on it. So I don't know which order they came in, but Debbie Harry's face, I like a wide face. I don't like if you've got a long, thin face. Well, I like to draw a kind of fairly sort of wideish face, and she had that kind of face that I liked. And also, I kind of like the fact that Dredd is always scowling. Only very rarely do you see him without the scowl. So in contrast, she had to have this breezy, kind of nonchalant, smiley demeanor. I don't know whether they've still kept that up.
Well, you've hit the nail on the head there with the word contrast, that she's not just in the way that she's written, but the way that she's drawn. She always seems to be intended as a contrast to Dredd. So, you know,
she's like a foil to him, isn't she? Yes.
Yeah, and she's empathic where he isn't. She's, I guess, soft where he is hard. You know, that kind of thing. And
does she flirt with him?
I wouldn't call it flirting. They have a grudging respect for one another. I think.
Oh, right.
Arthur Ranson, who ended up drawing so many of her stories, did a story with Alan Grant called Satan in the magazine, where Dredd is forced to grudgingly accept that he respects her and that they are friends, which is always a bit of a watershed moment, I guess.
Crikey. Okay. Did I hear recently that Hershey is dead?
Yes and no.
Oh, I see. Well, it's always the case.
Well, it was. I mean, we had Rob Williams and Cy Fraser on to talk about the new series they're doing with her, because Rob had hatched a plan with Matt Smith in editorial and John Wagner, where she would die, quote unquote. But was using it as a cover to go off and exact revenge off-world, which is.
Did she become the chief judge at one point? Because
she was chief judge twice.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
she must be ancient by now.
Well, I think it's often forgotten that, you know, how many of the key characters, considering that you have Carlos, the co-creator, you have Mick, who's one of the definitive artists, but Anderson, Hershey, Judge Death, the Dark Judges, these are your co-creations.
Yeah.
And that's quite a run to have on a character that so many people were working on at the time.
Yeah, it is, isn't it? Yeah, but I mean, there's also a lot of others. I mean, like, is Otto Sump still on the go? Are the League of Fatties, are they still on the go?
The Fatties are still around. Sump products are still around.
Oh, I love the Fatties. Great. The Sump product. By the way, this week's cover, I got a real chuckle out of this week's cover. Noam Chomsky. I don't know how many people know who Noam Chomsky is, but anyway, Noam Chomsky.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's great. It's Kenneth Nyman and PJ Holden. Behind that one. Yeah. One thing I did want to ask about was people often talk about 2000 AD's punk aesthetic in its early days. And some people always have a bit of a chuckle because if you look at photos of early signings, there aren't many punks in evidence. There's I mean, you self-describe as a hippie in the period, I believe. And then you've got people like Ron Smith, who turns up to a signing in a three-piece suit. But you know, you touched on the black humor, on the satire of it all. Was that what really appealed to you, having not grown up, but read so many of those kind of early underground satirical mags like Oz? It was about the humor.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. Well, I always thought it had a punk aesthetic. I mean, it was. I mean, the Thatcher era started in '79, I believe, and we all had a lot of people. I know a few exceptions had a dislike of Thatcher and the Thatcher's England, and there were elements of sharp satire thrown into Judge Dredd, thanks to John Wagner and whoever was drawing it. But you're right, none of us was a punk. Rufus Dayglow, would you call him a punk? Is he a bit punky?
I think it's safe to say that Rufus is a punk. Yeah.
But you're right. But it did have that kind of anti-establishment, sort of disrespectful attitude. I mean, I grew up in the '60s, in the psychedelic '60s, and I liked psychedelic music and all that sort of stuff. But I also was a great fan of John Peel, the DJ, and he championed punk. I mean, I was too old to start putting safety pins in my nose at the time, or sort of slashing my jeans or whatever. But I love punk, the music. I just got it, and a lot of people in my generation didn't, because it was short, brutish, and it was like two chords and an attitude and spitting. And really, 2000 AD was really two chords and an attitude and spitting in its own way, without us bothering with the kind of spiky hair and the rest of it.
And in terms of your artwork, there's a real humor. I mean, I'm thinking back to things like when Judge Dredd was on the moon, and you had the Lunar Olympics, so you had the Soviets against Mega City 1 and things like that.
Yeah.
How keen were you to put little jokes and satirical elements in your own artwork?
I was imagining I'm going to be able to find the very thing we're talking about instantly, but it's an interesting question. I haven't really got an answer, because all my influences up till now have been DC Comics, a bit of Marvel Comics, some Marvel Comics. I love Howard the Duck, Conan, things like that. And then the underground magazines, your Oz and everything. So why I was so keen was, it must have been in the script. It must have just said in the background there's a guy on wheels or something like that. But I mean, Mick's work was so fascinating. I think we just sort of borrowed from each other and just picked up the sort of satirical nature of the whole stuff and ran with it. It must have been in me somewhere all along, back when I was drawing, even when I was drawing superheroes, But I took to it without any great effort. I can't tell you why.
Because your style at the time, and still feels so classical. It feels almost like it's drawing upon people like Beardsley and those kind of nature, banging in the background, and a Gothic tradition as well. I mean, were these conscious choices, or was that just how you had come to draw by this point?
Well, as the old art school type, I had sucked up all of the, your Beardsley and your Rackham, and, I acknowledged all of those people. I had a phase when I was, as a kid, when I was very keen on Salvador Dali. But I was also a great fan of, I was a DC collector, so I was a great fan of Gil Kane, Carmine Infantino, Murphy Anderson. I loved his work. Now, he was very much in the old-fashioned sort of, in a way, kind of classical tradition. And I think it's very useful. I always thought it's very useful to have a very classical style, or way of delivery, especially if you want to deliver something really fucking weird. It's great if you've got a really, Mick has got a terrifically expressionistic and idiosyncratic style, which is lovely to look at. My style is very, in a way, it'd be quite nice if you were so instantly drawn into it that you didn't look at the style. You immediately looked at what's being depicted by the style. And that was always my philosophy, that I want to draw properly, but only so that I can put on the page something really fascinating and kind of, ooh, what's that? Or, oh, wow, look at that. So yeah, I think my style is fairly classical, and you could trace it back to, I suppose, a lot of those slick Americans like Alex Raymond and all those people. I don't want to compare myself to people like that, but those are the people I looked at. But then if you can then pull that off and put something on the page like Judge Fish or any of those other great... one of my favourite runs of anything was doing the Eagle covers on the Eagle reprints of the 2000 AD stuff for America. And that was because I'd already read those stories. They were great stories. There were great characters in there. And of course, this is obviously the thing to put on the cover. Judge Dredd is about to be eaten by Satanus, and he says, "Come quietly or there'll be trouble." Or he's about to be crushed by a Soviet tank. They're all ideas ready to put on paper. I think I'm digressing again, aren't I?
No. I was going to come on to talk about those actually, because they are the introduction to Judge Dredd for so many American readers. Those Eagle reprints, and those covers just distilled down what the content into a single moment to the point where almost you have like a Mandela effect where people think that they've read in the story what was on your Eagle reprint cover, even if it's not necessarily exactly the same. The period of the mid-'80s, there seemed to be a growing consciousness amongst yourself and other artists and writers such as John Wagner that money was being made from your work that you weren't seeing any return from, and you eventually come to Thark's Head Revisited, which was the strip in the 500th issue where you and Mick and we did single things. I think it was Mick's that had to be redrawn because he'd been quite
was this the satirical one where we were all having a complaint about not getting anything from all the reprints?
Yeah. That's a remarkable thing to happen, really, wasn't it?
Yeah, but except mine had to be the text had to be edited out a bit. Press the button.
Yeah. Well, I didn't say anything.
I said. It had to be slightly watered down a little bit. I was looking at that the other day, and I think it had to be watered. It was good fun to do that.
I guess why I find it interesting is because it was expressing real frustrations that you were having? Because you had a particular issue with the return of artwork, didn't you? Or the non-return of artwork?
I did, yes. Well, at a certain time, I guess it must have been in the 80s, I think IPC decided that there was so much artwork sitting in vaults there that what are we going to do with this stuff? And somebody had the outrageous idea of returning it to the artists, something that had never been done before because they own the stuff, you know. And we'd been asking if we could get our artwork back for a long time, but eventually they said, well, look, if you can come and give us a list of everything of yours that we have, we'll return it to you. But we would like you to pay to have transparencies made of it. Well, I was busy, you know, we're always busy. So Mike Lake of Titan Books, of Forbidden Planet, went to collect all the artwork for me. And I'd made a list of getting on for 300 pages. And I think he came back with 180 or 215, or I think it was more than 100 pages that had gone somewhere else. And I've always had a suspicion as to the links of the chain of where the artwork went to, but a lot of those pages never came back to me. Some of them did. Fortunately, I'd borrowed pages from the Four Dark Judges to go into an exhibition somewhere. And so I had those at home, but a lot of pages I never saw return. Yeah.
With how things were in British publishing, your love of American comics, your switch over to your move to DC, I find really interesting because you had Joe Staton, I think it was, staying at your house.
It's Staton. Joe Staton, yes. Richard Burton, who I think was Bert at 2000 AD for a while, he had his own fanzine. He had Comic Media News, in which he had links with all the people at DC. Paul Levitz at DC was his pal, and Joe Staton was in this country. I've said this story quite often, but he was in this story to go to a convention, and he needed to carry on drawing Green Lantern. And I'll make this brief. And Richard Burton, who knew the story from Paul Levitz at DC, asked if we could borrow my wife's drawing table. And so Joe came and drew on my wife's drawing table at Green Lantern. And I was a great fanboy of Green Lantern and DC Comics right from age 10. So it was, and Jack C. Harris, the editor, said, yeah, come and do a cover for us. Or not come, but do a cover for us. So that's my first, and it was such a treat because, you know, deep down, yes, you're a fan. I mean, I was a fan of Gil Kane, who was who I met a few times after that, who was the artist on Green Lantern in the early days.
There's a lot of talk about the British invasion of the 1980s, and you're often named as part of it. Did you get the sense of it at the time? Because you did that amazing cover, which was Dredd having blown open a door, and it says the European invasion. He says, "Come on in, the doors open."
Yes, that was Amazing Heroes. It was one of I think it was a Fantagraphics fanzine. Yeah, I also did a Fantagraphics Comics Journal cover that had Uncle Sam and John Bull, and they're sort of hugging each other, and there's arm in arm, and to do with, you know, how the Brits had sort of invaded the American, hermetically sealed American comics world. Yes, and I sort of saw myself at the beginning of a particular period of invasion, although there were a few people like Barry Windsor Smith who had been drawing Conan before that, but he went home to live there. But yeah, there was me, and then Dave Gibbons and Kevin O'Neill, and Mick McMahon did some, but he hasn't done an awful lot of American work.
Not loads, no. I think the last American that you did with John and Alan, that was meant to be an American thing. I think that was for Epic.
Yeah, I think my style melded okay into the American comics because I could do the superhero stuff, and Dave too. Kevin did some Green Lanterns, and I heard a story that one of the editors took one look at Kevin's work and said, "I don't want this guy to ever work for us again." It's just so weird.
Even by Kevin's standards, there's some pretty odd stuff in his Green Lantern work, I think.
Really? Is there?
Yeah. But what was it always about DC heroes? Because you say you weren't massively into Marvel, but it was DC. What was it about their characters that really grabbed you when you were younger and has stuck with you all these years?
It was the artists, really. I mean, I was a follower of the artists. I think I said earlier that I'm completely absorbed by the images. So I was riveted by certain artists, Gil Kane, Carmine Infantino, and others who are less, big names. Bruno Premiani was I loved his work on Doom Patrol. He did the first Doom Patrols, which is now a very strange TV series. Have you seen it at all?
I haven't watched it, no.
No, it's very, very weird. And so I think I was very kind of imprinted, or DC Comics were imprinted on me in a completely visual way. I just liked the way a Carmine Infantino Flash cover looked, for instance, and a Green Lantern or Atom cover. I just loved it. Marvel came along in '63. I quite liked Steve Ditko's work, but I'm going to get myself into a whole lot of trouble now by saying that I was never a fan of Jack Kirby. I know.
You've done it now.
My career is over. My career is over. It was only later on, as an art student, when you can look at all kinds of art, and I can see why it's popular and why it really is a signature to the Marvel style. But it was never in my heart to love Kirby, because his anatomy is all buggered, isn't it? He makes it all up, doesn't he? But I'm very sympathetic to the story of how Stan Lee has taken all the credit for everything that he and Steve Ditko really more than co-created, I think. I had a collection. I had complete runs of Green Lantern, Atom, all sorts of strange things. I had a complete run of My Greatest Adventure, Strange Adventures. These are all comics that really started in the 50s. And when you collect things and you want to collect a complete run of something, you then can't go and find another entire publishing group, because that adds another strain to your wallet, really, isn't it? But I mean, there were certain exceptions. I loved Howard the Duck. I think for me, you only need 2 or 3 superheroes, basically. You need a Batman, a Superman, and a Wonder Woman. And a lot of the characters at DC seem to be very much their versions of the DC characters. I mean, people tell me that they wrote it in a better way, in a sort of way where they all had psychological problems and stuff. But I didn't quite see the necessity for having Ant-Man or any of those other similar. Hawkeye was just like Green Arrow.
With your DC work, after you'd done a few covers, you were then approached to do Camelot 3000, which was a fairly unique idea at the time for DC, because it was meant to be like a standalone series.
Well, right at the beginning of the direct sales experiment, wasn't it, where the people they weren't going into newsagents anymore, and it was a limited edition, 12-issue limited series printed on good paper. And so it was, I think Marvel had done a thing called Dazzler, which was also a direct sales, but this, I think, was the first maxi series in American comics that was done that way. Yes, but did you have a further question?
I did. And this was an original creation. What were your feelings about it at the time? Because you'd done covers for some of your favourite characters, but now here's a new thing coming along that can be just yours.
Well, I mean, having done Powerman and Judge Dredd, where I had a regular gig, I knew that I had to seek regular employment at DC because I do this for a living, you know. That's the intention anyway. So when a major project came along, I was delighted to dive in feet first. I did sort of think, I think they probably thought, well, okay, Camelot 3000, King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, Bolland, he's a Brit, he'll know about that stuff. I didn't know anything about it at all, really. I'd probably seen a Disney film. So I did, but it turned out to be a sort of science fiction take on the whole thing by Mike Barr. Now, I love working with Mike Barr. He's a terrific character, and we had lots of funny telephone conversations. I remember the time he told me, in the script, it told me that King Arthur was pissed. And I thought, when has he been drinking or what? And that was when I first discovered that they have a different language over there in America, that when you're pissed over there, it means you're cross. So we had a number of funny interchanges with the difference in language. But also it got me, because I had to draw Stonehenge and all that sort of thing, it got me out into this country, exploring the ancient sites of this country. So I became very hooked on Neolithic Britain and all the stone circles and all these strange, mysterious things we have littered about the place. And I actually took Mike W. Barr, and I got a permit to go into Stonehenge. Not in that long perimeter you have, you can actually get a permit to go right into the stones. And so I got into it that way.
What difference did Camelot 3000 make for your career? You know, looking at it in hindsight, was that the kind of big step fully into the American market?
Well, in the 80s, there were a few people sort of breaking the mold, weren't there? Notably Frank Miller. I mean, Camelot was so close to what comics always looked like that there was hardly anything. It was only the kind of format that was a bit different, although we had some lesbian scenes in it, which wasn't that common. And then, of course, Frank Miller came along with Ronin, which was, he completely reformatted comics. It was done the cover looked different. It was a kind of boxy backed thing. And so there were people going around. And then, of course, Miller did Dark Knight. Was it called The Dark Knight? And that was, he could almost recreated the character. He recreated the look of a Batman comic. And again, I've forgotten what your question was.
It's what effect Camelot 3000 had on your career?
Well, I mean, when you've had it was quite successful. Because it was before Frank Miller, I think. I don't know what else was going on at the time, but it was quite successful. I was very, very slow, and the last two issues came out incredibly late, and they sort of re-advertised them. But I think people liked it. DC were kind enough to give me a bonus when it was all over, because it had done reasonably well by those standards. So I was then in a position to, famously, I've said this to everybody, when I came back from a trip abroad, I said to Dick Giordano, what would you like me to do next? And he said, well, you can do anything you like. What would you like to do? So the next thing that came along was something which was Killing Joke with Alan Moore.
I was going to ask about that, because you recently did a big long post on Facebook explaining your recollection of what happened around that, without going into it word for word, because people can go and find out themselves. Yeah. How did that come about, and what were the consequences? What were the outcomes of doing the Killing Joke?
Well, how it came about was that we used to do Forbidden Planet signings every year, and Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons and all the rest of us, we used to meet up quite regularly, and also meet up at foreign conventions, and we all knew each other. And Nick Landor at Titan Books were thinking about launching a series of comics, Titan Comics possibly, and he had one lined up for Alan and me called Rocket Red Glare. You can look all this up, and also a Judge Dredd meets Batman crossover with IPC and DC. I'll keep this brief, which didn't come across either. But because we were mates and we felt we were going to do something together at some point, I thought and also Alan was pretty much towards the end of writing and creating Watchmen, which was terrific, a terrific revelation in comics. And so I was given the opportunity to do whatever I wanted. I could have whoever I wanted, and Alan was decent enough to say, "Yeah, I'll come along with that." That's how it came about. And what was the other question?
The consequences of it, because
the consequences of it. I was a bit disturbed by the script when it came in because I didn't think it was all that necessary to cripple Barbara Gordon, Batgirl. But I was more as years have worn on. I was more perturbed by the fact that Alan fell out with DC Comics for reasons that you can look up. I don't really know them fully, but he won't talk about Killing Joke. He can. I think ideally he would have bailed before he'd finished writing it. Actually, he rang me up part of the way through, and I think he was on the verge of telling me he didn't want to carry on with it, but he did, for which I'm eternally grateful. And he considers it a misstep in his career, and I think it's considered to be one of the lesser Alan Moore items in the world. To me, it was everything I could possibly hope for. It was the character I wanted to draw the most. It was the writer who was the best in the business. And so to me, I wanted it as a high point in my career. And to see it now as just an Alan Moore project and one of the lesser ones. So it's seen as a lesser Alan Moore commodity as opposed to one of my best bits, I suppose, is a shame. And also the fact that now Alan is out of the comics business. He's turned his back on it for all sorts of reasons. I feel I've lost a friend because we were good mates, I would say, all of us. So that's an upsetting thing for me.
Both you and Dave Gibbons have suffered that from the same thing a little bit, because when you see mainstream news coverage of The Killing Joke and Watchmen, it's always Alan Moore's Killing Joke and Alan Moore's Watchmen.
Well, I think I said that in the Facebook. I think it was because in that entire was it The Guardian, sort of looking back on Alan Moore's disturbing Batman comic, it was called, or what was it? Controversial Batman comic. I thought, there is this thing that everybody looks through a news item looking for their own name, but mine wasn't there at all. But and I wasn't thinking just for me, but I was sort of thinking that a lot of people, when they talk about comics, they know how to talk because they use the medium of words to talk about these things. What they're talking about is the stories. They don't really necessarily have the vocabulary to speak about. I mean, somebody like David Roach does, but they don't really even remember that there was some wretched artist had to draw this stuff. So it's not really necessary to name them. But anyway, yes.
I think sometimes they just kind of assume that everything that is drawn on the page was detailed in the script, and therefore you're essentially just a monkey with a pen.
To be fair on Alan, that is the most thoroughly described script I've ever read, and I didn't have to make anything up at all, really. I mean, all of the little incidental characters in the background, not all of them, some of them I added, but he visualized that whole thing so well in a way that a lot of writers just don't.
I mean, that book has virtually never been off the top 10 best-selling graphic novels. I mean, whenever we look at the sales reports, always Watchmen, always Killing Joke. I mean, for a project that you feel is the height of your career, or one of the highlights of your career, that must be still fairly gratifying, even though it didn't necessarily have the perfect ending.
Oh yes. I mean, I still think it's quite good. I think it's a great cover. I mean, that is it. I mean, I've got to credit myself for that, because I don't remember anybody telling me what to put on the cover at all. It just it told me itself what to put on the cover. And it was only after I'd drawn it and I'd seen it printed that I realised that the cover is actually a depiction of the most ghastly moment in the story, which happens off camera. So yeah, I'm very gratified. I do get royalty checks for it. It's made. Thank you, Alan, very much. It's made me a bit of an income.
One thing I want sorry, go on.
Oh, I was just going to say. Also, it comes out in all sorts of later editions. Like I've now got the. I've got this one that comes in a box. It's sort of. Oh yeah, there you go. Okay.
One thing I did want to ask was about colour, because we just had a look at the kind of ultimate Killing Joke, absolute Killing Joke edition, because you recoloured.
Well, it's all part of I've whittled on about this for ages, but I had this thing on the go for sort of being drawn for 2 years, because I could go on for ages, but after Len Wein, the editor, dropped out, nobody at DC was on the phone saying, "Where's this thing you're working on?" So I just got back to drawing some Judge Dredds and various other things, and it was 2 years before it came out. And I had by the way, I'd also seen David Mazzucchelli and Richmond Lewis's wonderful Batman Year One, which was a terrific looking thing, and good. Frank Miller too, and the colours were beautifully muted colours by Richmond Lewis, who was David's girlfriend. And so I had at least there were certain absolute things in the Killing Joke that I wanted. I wanted the flashback scenes. I'd recently seen, was the Elephant Man out by then, the David Lynch film? But I was possibly Eraserhead, but I loved, you've frozen, by the way, you're back. I really imagine these scenes in black and white, and I had a few little details off just sort of to the side of the frame up there, which will have a little bit of colour in them. And I gave these notes to John, and when the finished product came back, it was delivered to Titan Books, and it wasn't delivered to me. And I was on the phone to them, and I was very anxious to see how the colour was going to look. I said, "What's it like?" And somebody at Titan said, "Well, it's kind of garish." And I said, "What?" And so when I first got the colours, the printed edition, I wasn't pleased. I was upset, quite upset. And so when 20 years later they did the deluxe edition, I said, "Oh, can I recolour it, please?" And it's a bit cheeky, because, I mean, back in the original edition, it would have had to have been coloured on blue line, which was actually real ink on real paper. And the deadline was quite tight, and I couldn't have done it at the time. So it was good of John to jump in. But when 20 years later, I had the computer, Photoshop and the facilities, I said, "Look, I'd love to recolour it." But now, of course, it's set up a kind of people in the world are all, well, not everybody in the world, some people are say, "Oh, I prefer the original," and others say, "Oh no, I quite like these, the new colours." So it's that on the final page. It's something for people to have a controversy about.
Your comment about the Killing Joke cover made me think about how the last stage of your career, you've been very well known for doing covers, Wonder Woman, Animal Man, through to the Invisibles.
Yes.
Is that because you have a lot more freedom and that they are yours alone? There's no writer involved to a certain extent.
Yes, that is true. Well, of course, it was all to do with after the Killing Joke. A lot of people offered me work, and I couldn't do it all. And they said, "Well, what about just doing the cover?" And I said, "Okay." I mean, I need, I need to earn a living. So, fortunately, the covers were for people like Grant Morrison with Animal Man, and they had the kind of quirkiness that I was missing from. That was, I was missing from 2000 AD. There was a sort of subversion of the superhero meme in all of them, really, in Animal Man and certainly in the Invisibles, where I could get. Now that I knew how to use Photoshop on my computer, I was able to. Why not stick some photography in there? Sort of do a bit of photo collage and they gave Shelley Roberg and Grant Morrison were very open to me doing some very experimental stuff on the Invisibles. And then, of course, I did Flash and Wonder Woman, which were, Flash was certainly something I loved as a kid. So it was a real treat to be doing covers on Flash and Batman. Wonder Woman, I love Andrew Esposito's artwork on Wonder Woman and Metal Men. So I do have a respect for the artists and the styles of the period when I was growing up. So I'm quite keen occasionally to play it straight.
Do you think that's one of the reasons why your work has remained consistently popular with DC? That you do have that classic Silver Age element to how you present?
Occasionally I do a sort of an actual sort of pastiche of a Silver Age, I love doing that with because that's the sort of period. I mean, nostalgia does play a big part in being, a comic book artist. You love the comics that you had as a kid. Oh, I won't show you another one.
I mean, you mentioned there that Photoshop became increasingly part of how you work, and now you're. I think on the Invisibles you went fully digital for the first time, didn't you?
Yes, it was. Yeah, around about number. I was going to say season 2, but sort of part 2 number. You'll have to look up the number if you're interested, but part of the way through. It was Dave Gibbons that got me into Photoshop. I was a real Luddite. I didn't have a computer when everyone else did, but then I just plunged in at the at the deep end and hated it for months. I just hated this stuff. I didn't understand any of it. And but anyway, I'm what question do you have for me on that?
Oh, wait, it was just like what the appeal of using...
Well, the appeal was that I would be turning an artwork that was black and white, and colorists would increasingly be using computers to color it. And having the ability, they were able to use a lot more drawing elements. Like they had a thing called cuts, where they would, if you drew a figure, they would color it with sort of sharp lines going between this color and that color. So that line there was not a line you'd drawn, it was just a line created by the colorist. And I thought, hang on. And there was a lot of whiz-bang, flashy effects, some of which actually sort of obscured the line work. Sometimes the line work would be dropped out in a color. And I thought, hang on, these people have got way too much control over my drawings. Maybe I should learn how to do this coloring thing myself. So initially I got Photoshop because I wanted to learn how to color my own work. And then I discovered that the line work is still there, sitting on a layer while you're coloring over the top. Oh, hang on a minute, that bit of line work's a bit wrong. Let's just move that little line over a little bit, or maybe put another line in. And I realized that it was quite easy to do the line art in Photoshop as well as doing the color over the top of it. And in fact, there are some aspects to Photoshop that make it quite an attractive idea to use Photoshop, like the pen tool allows you to draw a smooth line, and you plot it in, and then you can move it around before, that's the right place. You can then press enter, and it's a line you've drawn, but the tool has made it smooth for you. You've got to know where to put the lines. It doesn't put them there for you, but there are tools in Photoshop that make it quite an attractive proposition.
I suppose this kind of links back to when you were talking about the brushes you were using when you were working on 2000 AD. That there's a sweet spot in the middle where the brush is perfect, but on a computer the sweet spot is always there. Yeah,
I lost the end of that sentence, but
wait, you're looking for the sweet spot with those brushes, but on the computer the sweet spot is always there.
Well, not necessarily. Well, yes, it is always there because I don't have to worry about whether my ink is too thick. You can draw a black line without having to get your brush out and stick it in the ink, and at the end of it, wash it. You don't have to sort of wash out your airbrush, having laid your flat colour on. You can just put a bit of flat colour in if you want, or anything. So some people really miss the tactile element of actually physically getting their hands dirty with paint. I was okay with brushes and black line, but when full colour painted covers were required from me, I really struggled. And my wife, Rachel, painted aspects of quite a lot of my cover. There's a tank girl which is picking up a bit of a reflection up there, which has got some of her painted work in.
One thing I'm always fascinated by with artists, and I talk with them. Do you know Jock?
I know the name, and
yep.
I've never met him. And I also have a little bit of trouble placing the artwork in my mind with the name.
Right, okay.
But I'm sure he's good.
Wait, when we've chatted in the past, we've talked about the notion of mark making. That he will draw a line, and the line will inspire the rest of, how that line turns out will inspire the rest of the drawing. Everything will move outwards from that line to form the broader drawing. And I'm wondering about your process. Do you have the image in your mind's eye to begin with, or do you put the mark on the page and then extrapolate outwards?
That's a very good question. I haven't drawn a lot. I keep drawing. I don't. Yes, I think I know what I'm going to be drawing before I put pen to paper. It doesn't materialize in front of me without me knowing what it's going to look like beforehand. No, I would say I have got a clear idea of what it is I'm going to draw, and then I don't think it works for me the way it does with Jock. I think I know what I'm going to draw, and then I attempt to draw it, with the limits of my abilities.
And with the options and the various different parts of the program of something like Photoshop, has it affected the way that you draw, the way that you put things together?
I personally think that it doesn't change the way I draw, because the way that the lines that the image on the page and the lines that I use to make that image, they are the lines I would have used regardless of whether I was using a brush and ink or the pencil tool or whatever. The tendency is to make it a bit smooth, because you can blow the thing up huge, and you can also put a lot too much detail in that isn't necessary, because you can, as I say, blow it up huge, and you could spend half an hour drawing an eye, and then when you go back to normal size, you realise you can hardly see it. And also, if you use real tools like paint, there is a lovely sort of texture which adds something to it. And there are tricks you can actually scan in textures and add them to Photoshop, the computer piece of work. But, and again, I've forgotten your initial question. But
it's fine. I mean, do you miss the tactile element of?
No, I don't actually. I'll tell you what I miss, and I do get a sense that people really don't like you for it. There's a stigma to working. They say computer generated. I don't like his computer generated work. And it sounds as if they're saying, I press a button that says draw Judge Dredd and the computer does it for me. They also resent the fact that there isn't a piece of artwork that they can have in their collection, and that I don't do sketches for people, because gradually over the years I've lost the knack of having the smooth drawing line that I would require from my work. So I miss the artwork, I miss looking at the artwork, and I think it's a shame that people really think it's cheating to some extent. But I really don't miss having to fuck around with my brush and my inks and my autograph protector and washing the brush out and all that sort of thing at all.
I just want to round things off by just because obviously this is the 2000 AD podcast.
Yes.
Looking back on your time at 2000 AD, we touched on it to a certain extent, but I kind of want to get your feelings about the legacy of that, about what it meant to you at the time, what it means to you now.
Well, I happen to think that I've been lucky enough to draw one of the very best characters we've ever produced in this country. I really think Judge Dredd. Well, he's been going a while, and he's not showing any sign of going anywhere. I mean, there's even possible talk of another film or a TV series, isn't there?
A TV series in production, yeah.
Yeah, with Carl Urban or not?
No comment.
Oh, I see. Okay. Yeah, I mean, it's in hard times, when we've gone through all sorts of crises, also with the fact that things, digital media and everything, but the fact that there is still a 2000 AD presumably selling. Is it selling?
Yeah,
Yes.
Still going.
Is quite a remarkable thing, because all those great comics from the Silver Age of comics that we produced in Britain didn't last this long, did they? And I also feel very fortunate that I, happened to be in the plum job at the right time. It's helped me no end, and I happen to, as I'm repeating myself, but I think Judge Dredd is a really good character, and I think people really ought to see him in the sort of grey tone and the sort of ironical tones that he's written in. Really, if they don't get it, then it's a shame.
One of the interviews that I read in a fanzine from not long after you'd started started drawing Judge Dredd.
Yeah,
you seem very conscious, as you are now, about what a morally grey character he is. So it's clear that from the very beginning you were on board with the satirical elements of it.
I think so. Yeah, and I think when he was first brought up by the Americans, because Americans. I may be underestimating them, but because they're so used to seeing your Superman and your Lex Luthor and all that, there's good guys and there's bad guys. There's adventure and there's comedy. And I often got the idea that they didn't see that Judge Dredd he's a fascist. He's an apparatchik of a police state. I think maybe that's two mixed sort of expressions, but I love the way you relate, if anything, as much to his opponent as himself, because I think a lot of things I've drawn, like Batman and the Joker, and Judge Dredd, and like the League of Fatties or Otto Sump or somebody. The moral perspective is not necessarily from the policeman. You're often sort of very much sympathising with the crazies that are being put down by this police state. So yes, the moral greyness is definitely to be noticed, I think.
And how do you feel about when people list, the top? Everything's subjective, but they list the top Dredd artists. You're always on there, along with Carlos and along with Mick and everyone else you can sort of argue about. But you had a body of work at 2000 AD that was a certain number of pages over a certain relatively short amount of time, but your impact kind of continues. I mean, how do you feel about that?
Well, I have continued to do covers, very intermittently nowadays, but I've been doing covers up until, I think the last one I did was not that long ago, but I suppose it's years. But because I'm very thankful to 2000 AD and Judge Dredd, and I like the character so much, I could do a cover for Judge Dredd any time I was asked.
I shall pass that along to editorial.
Yeah, okay. There was something I wanted to draw the other day. I mean, even Noam Chomsky, I thought, actually, I can do chimps. Maybe I'll do a Noam Chomsky cover. I don't know. Don't pass that one on.
No, it's fantastic. Brian, you've been so generous with your time on this. Thank you so much for chatting away. It's been absolutely fantastic. Thank you.
Oh, it's a pleasure.
Wow, fantastic. Thank you so much to Brian for that. That was absolutely fascinating. It was so wonderful just to be able to have a nice relaxed chat with him for so long. And yeah, it was just an absolute pleasure. Do get in touch if there are subjects or themes that you'd like us to feature on the 2000 AD Thrillcast in the future. But until next time, Earthlets, I do hope you are staying safe. This lockdown, it can be really difficult. People are reacting to it in different ways. People have their own challenges. But it has been really heartening and lovely to hear some of the feedback on the lockdown tapes from people saying how much they've enjoyed them, and yeah, how they're providing a little bit of thrill-powered listening while they're in isolation. So, like I said, stay safe, look after one another, and until next time, Splundig Verthrig.
Alert! 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 Thrill power levels dangerously high. Alert! Alert! Read 2000 AD every week. Ask your comic book store or newsagent now. Subscribe to the galaxy's greatest comic at 2000adonline.com.